Everyone thinks they know the Colosseum. They picture roaring crowds, clashing swords, bronze muscles glistening under the Roman sun. They imagine honor, glory, maybe even a dramatic thumbs-down sealing a doomed man's fate. It feels almost cinematic, like a perfectly choreographed sports event with sand instead of turf. But here's the brutal truth. For most gladiators, the Colosseum wasn't a stage for glory. It was a business. A blood-soaked, profit-driven machine powered by slavery, politics, and public obsession. Behind every cheer was a sponsor. Behind every fight was a contract. Behind every fight was a man who likely had no choice. The amphitheater we now call the Colosseum, built under Emperor Vespasian and completed by his son Titus in 80 CE, was less a monument to courage and more a monument to control. It fed the Roman appetite for spectacle while reinforcing who had power and who absolutely did not. This isn't the polished myth of brave warriors choosing death over dishonor. This is the real story. Long before the roar of 80,000 Romans echoed across the stone tiers of the Flavian amphitheater, a different sound marked the beginning of a gladiator's life. Chains. Most gladiators were not volunteers. They were prisoners of war, criminals, enslaved people bought at auction, or men condemned by the courts. Rome's empire stretched across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. Every military campaign brought captives back to Italy. And those captives became inventory. Some were sent to farms, some to mines, and some, the strong, the young, the physically impressive, were sold to a lanista. The lanista was not a noble trainer of athletes. He was a business owner dealing in flesh. He purchased men in bulk and sent them to a gladiator school or ludus. The most famous of these schools operated in Capua and later in Rome itself, just beside the Colosseum. Inside the ludus, the transformation began. The men were stripped of their former identities. Names from Gaul, Thrace, Germania, or Numidia were replaced with stage names designed to excite Roman crowds. A defeated soldier might become Spiculus or Flamma. A condemned criminal might be rebranded as the Barbarian or the Avenger. It was branding before branding existed. Training was brutal but calculated. Contrary to modern imagination, gladiators were valuable investments. When this day did not want them slaughtered instantly. They were fed high-calorie diets, mostly barley and beans, earning them the nickname hordearii, or barley men. Their body fat was deliberately maintained at higher levels to protect vital organs from shallow cuts. They trained with wooden weapons heavier than real swords, building endurance and strength. They practiced specific fighting styles based on their assigned gladiator type. A murmillo carried a large rectangular shield and a short sword. A retiarius fought with a net and trident. A thraex used a curved blade and small shield. These roles weren't random. They were designed for contrast and drama. The retiarius, lightly armored and agile, would face a heavily armored secutor. The visual difference made the fight more entertaining. Rome didn't just want blood, it wanted spectacle. And while some men were forced into this life, a small percentage were volunteers, known as actorati. These were free Roman citizens who signed contracts to fight. Why would anyone willingly enter such a world? Debt, desperation, or the dangerous lure of fame. Successful gladiators could win prize money. They could gain admiration. Graffiti discovered in Pompeii reveals women writing about their favorite fighters with the same obsession reserved today for celebrities. Some gladiators became symbols of strength and virility. But the price was enormous. Upon entering the school, every gladiator swore a sacred oath to endure being burned, bound, beaten, and killed by the sword. Iuri vincere verari fedeque nicari. It was not poetic. It was literal. Life in the ludus was heavily controlled. The men lived in small cells, locked in at night. They trained under former gladiators who had survived long enough to retire. Medical care existed surprisingly advanced for the time because, again, dead assets made no money. But discipline was absolute. Escape was rare, though not impossible. The most famous rebellion began in 73 BCE when a gladiator named Spartacus led dozens of fighters in an uprising from the ludus at Capua. What followed was a full-scale slave revolt that terrified Rome for 2 years. Rome crushed it brutally. Thousands of captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way as a warning. The message was clear. This system would not be dismantled. By the time the Colosseum opened in 80 CE, the machinery was perfected. Gladiator schools functioned like factories. The empire supplied raw material. The lanista refined it. The arena displayed it, and the Roman public consumed it. Before a single drop of blood touched the sand, an entire industry had already profited. Yet nothing in the training yard truly prepared a man for the moment the gate opened and the arena swallowed him whole. Because training was one thing. Facing 80,000 screaming citizens and an emperor watching your every move was another entirely. And that is where the illusion of glory truly began to crack. By the time the sun rose over Rome, the city was already vibrating with anticipation. Game days were not casual affairs. They were political theater, religious ritual, and mass entertainment wrapped into one carefully engineered spectacle. The Colosseum, officially known as the Flavian Amphitheater, dominated the skyline like a stone declaration of imperial power. Completed in 80 CE under Emperor Titus and begun by his father Emperor Vespasian, it stood as a promise to the people Rome would entertain you. And in Rome, entertainment meant blood. Long before Gladiator stepped onto the sand, the machinery behind the event had been moving for weeks. Wealthy magistrates or the emperor himself sponsored the games. These were not charity events, they were investments in popularity. Bread and circuses, as the poet Juvenal later described it, kept the masses satisfied. Grain fed their stomachs, violence fed everything else. The morning of the games began with a procession known as the Pompa. Participants marched into the arena in elaborate display. Musicians, officials, priests, exotic animals, and finally, the gladiators themselves. This was branding in motion. It was pageantry meant to transform enslaved fighters into larger-than-life figures. The crowd saw armor gleaming in the sunlight. They saw polished helmets, embossed shields, carefully styled hair. They saw warriors. They did not see the fear. From the stands, 80,000 spectators filled the Colosseum in strict social order. Seating reflected Rome's hierarchy with almost mathematical precision. Senators closest to the arena, equestrians behind them, ordinary male citizens higher still, women and the poor at the top tiers. Even in death matches, status mattered. Below them, the hypogeum buzzed with preparation. The hypogeum was a labyrinth beneath the arena floor, a network of corridors, cages, elevators, and trapdoors. It held animals imported from across the empire, lions from North Africa, leopards, bears, even elephants. Slaves operated winches and pulleys, ready to lift beasts or fighters into the arena at precisely the right moment. Timing was everything. The games themselves followed a structure. Morning was reserved for venationes, animal hunts. Professional hunters faced wild beasts in carefully staged encounters. Sometimes the animals fought each other. Sometimes criminals condemned to death were thrown into the arena unarmed, part of the midday execution spectacle called damnatio ad bestias. This was not incidental cruelty. It was deliberate. Executions were woven into mythological reenactments. A condemned man might be dressed as Orpheus and torn apart by animals. Another might play the role of Icarus and be pushed from a platform to his death. These performances blurred punishment with entertainment. Justice became theater. By midday, the sand was already stained. Then came the main event. The gladiatorial combats typically began in the afternoon. When the heat intensified and the crowd's appetite sharpened, fighters entered in pairs, often matched for contrast. A heavily armored Murmillo against the agile Retiarius. Athraeus against a Hoplomachus. The combinations were designed to create suspense. Contrary to modern myth, not every fight ended in death. Gladiators were expensive assets. Training them required time, food, medical care, and investment. If a fighter performed well, even in defeat, he could be spared. The decision did not rest solely on the crowd's infamous thumbs gesture, which historians still debate in meaning, but ultimately with the editor, the sponsor of the games, often the emperor himself. Still, mercy was never guaranteed. Combat was intense and methodical. These were not chaotic brawls. Gladiators were trained professionals who understood distance, timing, and stamina. They aimed to wound strategically, hamstrings, arms, shoulders, seeking advantage rather than immediate slaughter. But accidents happened. A missed block, a slip in the sand, a trident piercing deeper than intended. When a fighter was wounded and could no longer continue, he might raise a finger and surrender. The crowd erupted, signaling their preference. The sponsor weighed popularity against expense. A skilled fighter might live to fight again. An unpopular one might be executed where he knelt. The fallen gladiator was expected to die well. Roman audiences valued virtuous courage, endurance, composure in the face of death. A man who begged was despised. A man who accepted his fate calmly could earn respect even in execution. After the decision, an official dressed as Mercury would approach the body with a heated iron to confirm death. Another, dressed as Charon, might strike the corpse with a mallet. These ritual gestures reinforced the mythological framing of the event. Death in the arena was not random. It was ceremonial, and through it all, the emperor watched. When Titus inaugurated the Colosseum in 80 CE, the opening games reportedly lasted 100 days. Ancient sources like Cassius Dio claimed thousands of animals were slaughtered. The numbers may be exaggerated, but the scale was undeniable. The message was clear. Rome had resources so vast it could kill them for sport. The crowd roared approval. For the spectators, this was a break from the hardships of daily life. Overcrowded housing, political uncertainty, economic strain. The arena offered clarity. In the sand there was no ambiguity about power. You won, or you died. But beneath the cheers and spectacle something darker lingered. Because while some gladiators survived multiple fights and even gained fame, the majority lived under constant uncertainty. Every appearance in the arena could be the last. Injuries accumulated, scars layered upon scars. The promise of freedom, symbolized by the wooden sword called the rudis, dangled like a distant dream. Few reached it. And as the day of games ended, as workers raked the blood-soaked sand and prepared the arena for the next spectacle, The surviving gladiators were led back underground, back to their cells, back to the waiting. The crowd went home exhilarated. The fighters went home knowing they had simply survived one more day. But survival did not mean safety, because in Rome, popularity could rise as quickly as it fell. And, in the next chapter, the illusion of celebrity begins to unravel, revealing what fame truly meant inside the brutal economy of the arena.